Chama Valley, Rio Arriba, New Mexico, autumn of 1889. At 8,000 feet, the air was already a knife. The aspens had surrendered their gold, leaving skeletal white trunks against the bruised purple of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Down in the valley, where the river cut a sharp, cold line through the land, most men were chinking the gaps in their log cabins, banking earth against their foundations, and stacking cords of piñon and juniper. But Ignacio Delgado was not like most men. He, along with the heads of the Montoya and Romero families, was not building, but clearing. Their work was focused on a long, dead giant sleeping on the valley floor, the abandoned Franciscan mission of Nuestra Señora del Rosario. Closed since 1834, it was a ruin, a relic of a Spanish past the new territorial government was eager to forget. Its 80-foot-long adobe walls were slumped and weathered, the lime plaster scarred and peeling. To the Anglo settlers pushing into the valley, it was an eyesore. To the Hispano families who had been here for generations, it was a ghost. To Ignacio Delgado, it was an ark. One crisp October afternoon, a buggy rattled up the track. In it sat Chesterfield Whitaker, a clerk from the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe. His face pinched with the self-importance of a man who wields regulations as a weapon. He was showing a pair of prospective land buyers from Ohio the parcels available for homesteading. He stopped the buggy, gesturing with a gloved hand toward the three families working at the mission. They were mixing mud and straw in a shallow pit, not for new bricks, but for patching the ancient walls. Soledad Delgado and Isabel Montoya were inside, sweeping decades of packed dirt and animal droppings from the flagstone floors. "There you have it," Whitaker announced to his passengers, his voice carrying on the thin air. "The sheer foolishness of the natives, wasting their energy on a pile of mud that's legally property of the territory. Squatters, the lot of them." The man from Ohio, a Mr. Abernathy, squinted. "What are they even doing? That thing looks ready to fall down." "Who knows?" Whitaker scoffed, loud enough for Ignacio to hear clearly. "Some local superstition. It's madness. They should be building proper timber homes before the snow flies. This winter will break them in that ruin." Ignacio paused, his hands deep in the cool, wet adobe mixture. He looked at the clerk, at the well-fed men in their wool coats, and then at the massive 30-inch thick wall of the mission. He felt the faint warmth of the autumn sun on its surface. He said nothing. He simply plunged his hands back into the earth and continued his work. The mockery of men like Whitaker was a fleeting sound, as insignificant as the wind. The silence of the adobe was a promise. What did this Hispano adobero, a man whose ancestors had been shaping earth for centuries, understand about thermal mass that the officials from the territorial government, with their log cabin traditions and legal codes, had completely missed? What secret was held in those tons of sun-dried mud that a man armed with deeds and statutes could never comprehend? Before we see how this abandoned church becomes a vessel for survival against one of the harshest winters on record, I want to invite you to subscribe to our channel. We are dedicated to uncovering the lost wisdom of the past, the practical genius of ordinary people who solved extraordinary problems. I promise that by the end of this story, you won't just understand that it worked. You will understand precisely how the physics of a 30-inch adobe wall can defeat a high-altitude winter. And if you have a story of an old building with a clever design, tell us about it in the comments below. Ignacio Delgado was a man shaped by the land he occupied. He was not a logger from the eastern forests, nor a farmer from the flat prairies. He was an adobero. His papers identified him as a Genízaro, a descendant of the detribalized Native Americans, Pawnee, Apache, Ute, who had been captured, ransomed, and raised in the Spanish colonial world of New Mexico. It was a complex identity, placing him between worlds, but it gave him a unique inheritance, The building traditions of the Spanish, honed by centuries of indigenous knowledge of this specific, unforgiving place. His hands did not know the heft of an axe, as well as they knew the balance of a wooden form for tamping earth. His mind did not think in board feet, but in the precise ratio of clay, sand, and straw. He was a master of tapia, the ancient technique of rammed earth construction, and of the sun-dried adobe bricks that had defined the architecture of the Rio Arriba for 300 years. He knew how to read the soil, how to find the best clay near the riverbank, how to build a stone plinth foundation that would keep the earth walls from drawing moisture up from the ground. This knowledge was his birthright, but it offered little comfort during his family's first winter in the Chama Valley. They had rented a small jackhole, a crude structure of upright wooden poles plastered with mud. It was little more than a sieve against the cold. That was the winter he learned the true nature of high-altitude cold. It wasn't just an absence of heat. It was an active, malevolent force. He watched a neighbor's heavy saddle cinch buckle, forged from solid iron, snap at the tang when he tried to tighten it one morning, the metal made brittle as glass by the 20-degree air. He'd attended a baptism at the San Juan Pueblo where the priest's ink froze in the nib of his pen as he tried to write the child's name in the parish registry. In his own small larder, a tin of rendered sheep suet, a precious source of fat, had split its own waxy surface with a loud crack one January night, frozen solid to its core. The worst memory was of his wife Soledad and their two small children, Mateo and Lucia, huddled together under every blanket they owned, their breath pluming in the single room of the jacal. The fire in the small hearth devoured wood, roaring for heat that vanished moments after it was created, sucked out through the 1,000 tiny gaps in the walls. He saw the fear in Soledad's eyes and the pale, pinched look on his children's faces. He swore he would not let them endure another winter like that. He would not fight the cold. He would find a way to hold the warmth. His gaze kept falling on the ruin of the old mission, standing silent and immense in the snow. While others saw decay, he saw mass. He saw memory. He saw a solution. The problem with the frontier structures being built by the new arrivals was that they were fundamentally unsuited for the environment. The log cabin, a symbol of American pioneering, was an import from the forested, humid climates of the East. In the dry, thin air of the Rocky Mountains, at 8,000 feet, it was a thermal disaster. A typical cabin wall was made of logs perhaps 8 to 10 inches thick. The spaces between them were packed with a mixture of mud, moss, or grass called chinking. The builder's primary concern was structure, making a solid, square building. Insulation was an afterthought. The R value, the measure of thermal resistance of such a wall, was minimal. Heat, following the inexorable laws of physics, moved from warmer to cooler areas. In a log cabin, the roaring fire heated the interior air, which then immediately transferred its energy to the cold logs, which in turn radiated it out into the sub-zero landscape. Worse yet was air infiltration. As the logs dried and shrank in the arid climate, the chinking would crack and pull away, creating dozens of tiny, invisible gaps. On a windy night, and every winter night in the Chama Valley was windy, the cold air would knife through these cracks. A family could sit inches from a blazing fire and feel a draft of Arctic air on the backs of their necks. Candles would flicker and gutter, not from a spiritual presence, but from the constant, unseen flow of air. The cabins of his Anglo neighbors, like the Millers and the Cartwrights, were locked in a futile, expensive battle. They had to burn wood constantly, a full cord or more every few weeks, just to keep the interior temperature above freezing. The result was a house of extremes, scorching hot near the fireplace, dangerously cold in the corners, and filled with smoke from the overworked chimney. It was a design that guaranteed exhaustion, illness, and a constant gnawing anxiety about the dwindling woodpile. These structures were designed to shed water and hold up a roof. They were never designed to hold heat. They were thin-skinned shells, offering psychological comfort, but little physical defense against a cold that could freeze mercury. Ignacio understood this in his bones. The problem wasn't a lack of firewood. The problem was the container. You could not carry water in a sieve, and you could not hold warmth in a log cabin. The work on Nuestra Señora del Rosario was not a construction project. It was an act of restoration, of waking a sleeping giant. Ignacio directed the three families with a quiet, confident authority. He wasn't a boss. He was a teacher, explaining the why behind every task. The Montoya family, Juan and Isabel, and their two teenage sons, and the Romeros, old Felipe and his widowed daughter Elena, put their trust in him completely. They had all suffered through winters in flimsy shacks. They were ready for something different. Their first task was to clear the interior. For more than 50 years, the mission had been a barn, a way station, a ruin. They shoveled out a thick, compacted layer of dirt, straw, and the droppings of countless birds and animals. Underneath it all, the original flagstones were mostly intact. As they worked, the sheer scale of the place became apparent. The main nave, which would become their shared sala or living hall, was a vast space, 80 feet long and 30 feet wide, with a ceiling of heavy wooden beams, or vigas, nearly 15 feet overhead. Across the vigas lay a dense lattice of stripped aspen branches called latillas, which in turn supported a thick layer of earth. The true focus of Ignacio's attention, however, was the walls. They were 30 inches thick, constructed of sun-dried adobe bricks laid in mud mortar. He walked the entire perimeter, inside and out, tapping and listening. He showed Juan Montoya how to identify hollow spots where the exterior lime plaster had failed and allowed moisture to erode the adobe behind it. "The walls are the heart," Ignacio explained, his palm flat against the cool, earthy surface. "They must be whole. No breaks, no leaks." They spent weeks mixing a new batch of lime plaster. They couldn't afford to buy processed lime, so they built a rustic kiln and burned limestone harvested from a nearby cliff, a slow, hot process that took days. Then they slaked the quicklime with water, a hissing, steaming transformation that yielded the brilliant white putty they needed. With trowels and their bare hands, they sealed every crack and scar on the mission's exterior, giving it a new, unbroken skin to face the winter winds. They did the same on the inside, the fresh white plaster brightening the cavernous space. The final and most crucial element was the hearths. The mission had 3 large built-in corner fireplaces known as fogones. One was in the small room off the nave that had once been the cocina, the kitchen. Another stood in the center of the long nave wall, ready to warm the main sala. The third was in the smaller, semi-private space of the old capilla, or chapel, which the families would use for sleeping quarters. These were not the inefficient, open fireplaces of Anglo design. The fogon had a deep firebox and a carefully shaped throat designed to draw smoke up while throwing heat out into the room. Ignacio and the Montoya boys spent 2 days on the roof, clearing the chimneys of birds' nests and debris, ensuring a clean, safe draw. It was during this work, in late October, that Chesterfield Whitaker made his formal visit. He rode up not in a buggy, but on his official horse, a sheaf of papers in his saddlebag. He dismounted with an air of weary authority. "Delgado," he said, not waiting for a greeting, "I'm here to give you official notice. As I told you, this is secularized Franciscan land. Upon the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the establishment of the territory, all such untitled church properties reverted to the public domain. They are administered by the United States government. You are, in legal terms, trespassing." Ignacio looked down from the low-pitched roof, where he was sealing the chimney, flashing with a mixture of clay and pitch. He wiped his hands on his trousers. "The winter is coming, Senor Whitaker. We need a place for our families." Whitaker gave a short, humorless laugh. "You are wasting your time on a ruin that is not yours. The government will be surveying this entire tract for sale in the spring. You and your friends will be evicted. I am filing the papers in Santa Fe next month." He gestured at the freshly plastered walls, gleaming white in the sun. "Enjoy your mud fort while you can. I suspect the first real blizzard will make my eviction notice irrelevant." He tacked a formal-looking document to the old wooden door of the mission, mounted his horse, and rode away without a backward glance. Juan Montoya came over to where Ignacio stood. "What do we do?" Ignacio looked at the notice, then at the sky, where the first gray clouds of winter were gathering over the mountains. "We finish our work," he said. "The paper can wait. The cold will not." To understand what Ignacio Delgado was building, you have to unlearn everything a log cabin teaches you about heat. A log cabin wall is meant to be a barrier. It's a form of insulation, attempting to slow the passage of heat from inside to outside. It's a defensive strategy, and in a place like the Chama Valley, a losing one. The 30-inch adobe wall of the mission was something else entirely. It was not a barrier, it was a battery. This principle is called thermal mass. It refers to the ability of a material to absorb, store, and later release heat energy. The two key properties are density and specific heat. The adobe of the mission walls was incredibly dense, weighing around 100 pounds per cubic foot. A single 80-foot-long wall, 12 feet high and 2.5 feet thick, contained 2,400 cubic feet of material, weighing a staggering 240,000 pounds, or 120 tons. The entire mission's exterior walls represented nearly 500 tons of solid earth. The second property is specific heat. This is a measure of how much energy it takes to raise a material's temperature. Water has a specific heat of 1.0. Adobe's is about 0.24. This means it takes a significant amount of energy to warm it up, but conversely, it has to lose that same amount of energy to cool down. It is slow to change. Let's translate this into the currency of heat, the British Thermal Unit, or BTU. 1 BTU is the energy needed to raise 1 pound of water by 1 degree Fahrenheit. Because of its density and specific heat, a single linear foot of the mission's 30-inch adobe wall could store approximately 21,600 BTUs of heat energy with a significant temperature swing. With roughly 220 linear feet of exterior wall, the mission structure could act as a thermal reservoir holding over 4.75 million BTUs. It was a bank account for warmth. Here's how the system worked in practice. In the late afternoon, the families would build small, efficient fires in each of the 3 fogones. They used piñon and juniper, woods that burn hot and clean. For several hours, these fires weren't primarily heating the air in the vast room. They were pouring thousands of BTUs of radiant energy directly into the dense adobe walls and the flagstone floor. The inner surface of the walls soaked up this energy, and the heat slowly began to migrate through the 30 inches of earth. By the time the families went to sleep, the fires were allowed to burn down to glowing coals. In a log cabin, this would mean a rapid plunge in temperature. But in the mission, this was when the magic began. The massive, warmed walls, now hotter than the cooling interior air, began to release their stored energy. They radiated a gentle, even warmth back into the space. It wasn't a blast of hot air. It was a pervasive, steady presence. The walls themselves became the heating system. This process created a remarkable phenomenon. The interior temperature of the mission was buffered from the wild swings of the outside world. The 48-hour cycle of charging, with fire, and discharging, radiating heat, meant the inside of the mission tracked the average outdoor temperature, not the daily highs and deadly lows. The physics dictated that the stable interior temperature would float roughly 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit above the 24-hour average outside. So if the day's high was 10 degree Earth and the night's low was 20 degree Earth, an average of 5 degree Earth, the mission's interior would hover in the stable and survivable range of 50-55 degree Earth. Using a fraction of the fuel a log cabin would burn just to stay above freezing. Ignacio wasn't fighting the cold. He was managing energy, using tons of earth as his partner. That November, the winter came not as a guest, but as a conquering army. The first storm dropped 2 feet of snow, and it never left. The sky turned a permanent metallic gray. For 6 months, the Chama Valley was under siege. The snowpack deepened to 4 feet on the level, with drifts burying fences and outbuildings. The river itself seemed to slow, choked with ice, and on the coldest nights a thick, sub-zero fog would rise from it, coating every surface in a crystalline armor of frost. The official weather station in Santa Fe would later confirm that the valley endured 32 nights where the temperature was sustained at 22 degrees or colder. For the settlers in their log cabins, it was a season of pure misery. The Miller family, whose patriarch had laughed at Ignacio's efforts, ran out of their main woodpile by New Year's. Mr. Miller was forced to venture into the deep snows of the forest, trying to fell and limb frozen timber with an axe that stung his hands like fire. His wife kept a pot of water perpetually on the stove, not for cooking, but because the steam it produced was the only thing that seemed to combat the painful dryness of the superheated, then supercooled air. Their windows were opaque with a thick layer of frost on the inside, a sign of massive heat loss and humidity condensing on the frigid glass. The Cartwrights, who lived a half-mile downriver, fared even worse. Their youngest son developed a deep, rattling cough in December that never left him. The family lived in a constant twilight, their windows covered with blankets to stop the drafts. Their world shrunk to the small circle of warmth around their perpetually hungry stove. Inside Nuestra Señora del Rosario, another reality prevailed. The 3 families had settled into a communal rhythm dictated by the season and the building itself. The vast space was zoned by function. The old cocina was the heart of food preparation, its fogon used for simmering stews and baking bread in a cast-iron oven. The great sala was the commons, a place for work and community. During the day, the women would sit there carding wool or mending clothes, their hands nimble and sure. The men repaired tack and tools. In the evenings, Ignacio would gather the children, his Mateo and Lucia, the Montoya boys, and Elena Romero's young daughter, and teach them their letters on a piece of slate. The third fogon, in the partitioned-off capilla, kept the sleeping quarters from ever becoming truly cold. The contrast was stark and absolute. Outside, the world was a monochrome nightmare of white snow and black, frozen trees, the temperature a deadly 22 graus. Inside, the air was still and quiet, holding a steady, comfortable 55 degrees. There were no drafts. A candle placed on the floor burned with a steady, unwavering flame. The domestic reality was one of impossible normalcy. Soledad could mix a batch of dough for tortillas and leave it to rise on a wooden table 30 feet from the nearest fire, confident in the ambient warmth. The most telling detail was the children. They were not bundled in layers, not huddled over the hearth. They played on the floor in their shirt sleeves, their laughter echoing faintly in the enormous room. Outside, the wind howled, piling snow in drifts against the mission's white walls. Inside, Lucia Delgado, her small hands pink and warm, used a piece of charcoal to draw a picture of a horse on a scrap of paper, her world defined not by the raging blizzard, but by the silent, steady warmth of the earth around her. By February, Chesterfield Whitaker had nearly forgotten about the squatters in the old mission. His desk was piled high with the paperwork of the coming spring land rush. He was busy drawing up survey maps and title claims for the Ohio investors and others like them. On a bitterly cold but clear morning, he set out to place some survey markers on the tract that included the mission lands. He needed to confirm the boundaries himself before the deeds were finalized. The landscape was alien and treacherous. The road was a vague depression under 4 feet of snow, and he kept to the track packed down by wind and the occasional passage of a sledge. The cold was astonishing, a physical weight that seemed to press the very air out of his lungs. He was bundled in a buffalo coat, but the chill still found its way in. As he neared the mission, the road dipped toward a small, frozen creek bed where the wind had scoured the snow away, exposing a surface of pure, black glaze ice. His horse, a sturdy mare usually sure-footed, took one step onto the ice, and its legs went out from under it. It went down hard with a terrified squeal. Whitaker was thrown clear, landing in a deep snowdrift that cushioned his fall. But the horse was in trouble. It scrambled, panicked, and in its struggle to rise, it twisted a leg and threw its right foreshoe. It finally gained its feet, but it stood trembling, favoring the leg, the detached iron shoe lying starkly on the ice. Whitaker's heart sank. He was at least 5 miles from the nearest settlement. His horse was lame. The temperature was already dropping with the afternoon sun, and the wind was picking up, whispering of another night of profound cold. He was an experienced man of the territories. He knew with a sudden, sickening clarity that this was a life-threatening situation. He could not walk 5 miles in this cold, and he couldn't abandon his horse. There was only one option, one single, humiliating possibility for shelter: the ruin he had condemned. Leading the limping mare, he trudged the last quarter mile to the mission. The building looked half buried in snow, silent and lifeless. He saw no column of smoke pluming from the chimneys, only the faintest, almost invisible haze. "They're gone," he thought with a grim satisfaction. Or worse. He expected to push open the door and find a frozen tomb, the families long fled or dead in their foolishness. He reached the heavy plank door, the eviction notice he'd tacked there months ago now just a frozen, illegible scrap. He put his shoulder to it and shoved. The door swung inward with a low groan. He braced himself for the expected blast of frigid, dead air, the smell of ice, rot, and failure. Instead, a silent, motionless wave of temperate air washed over his face. It wasn't hot. It wasn't smoky. It was just calm. His cheeks, numb and stinging from the wind, began to prickle with returning circulation. He blinked, his eyes adjusting to the dim light, and then he saw them. The great hall was filled with a quiet industry. Isabel Montoya and Elena Romero were at a long wooden table, kneading a mountain of dough. Juan Montoya's sons were on the floor, carefully tooling a piece of leather. Soledad Delgado looked up from the loom where she was weaving, her expression not of surprise, but of simple acknowledgement. And the children were there, playing a quiet game with carved wooden figures. They were all in their shirt sleeves. Ignacio Delgado saw him standing at the door, a frozen specter in his massive buffalo coat. He walked over, his own sleeves rolled to the elbow. "Senor Whitaker," he said, his voice even and calm, "you look cold. Come in. Your horse can shelter in the old sacristy." Whitaker stumbled inside, overwhelmed by the sensory shock. One of the Montoya boys was a passable smith, and he agreed to reset the horse's shoe. While they worked, Whitaker was given a seat on a stool near the sala fogon. He stared at it in disbelief. It held only a bed of glowing red-orange coals. There was no roaring fire, no bellowing heat. He gestured at it, confused. "How?" he managed to ask, his voice hoarse. "How, with so little fire?" Ignacio simply pointed a finger at the immense 30-inch thick wall beside the hearth. "The fire is not in the hearth, señor," he said softly. "The fire is in the wall." A few minutes later, Soledad approached him. She carried a bowl and a ladle. On a simple wooden shelf, far from any fire, sat a large earthenware crock. She lifted the lid, and a faint plume of steam rose from it. She ladled a thick red stew into the bowl and handed it to him. It was chile carne, rich with the smell of cumin and roasted peppers. It was perfectly, wonderfully warm. Whitaker held the warm bowl in his frozen hands. He looked at the crock on the shelf. He reached out and touched its side. The clay was warm through and through. He looked from the warm pot to the placid, working families, to the sleeping children in the corner, to the massive, silent, plaster-white walls that enclosed them all. And in that moment, the land office clerk from Santa Fe, the man of paper and law, finally understood. This was not a house. It was not a shelter from the cold. It was a container for warmth. The structure itself was the furnace. He looked at Ignacio, who was watching him with a patient, knowing gaze. Awe replaced his bureaucratic certainty. "You didn't build a wall," Whitaker said, his voice raspy with emotion. "You built a reservoir of summer." Chesterfield Whitaker's conversion was as complete as it was sudden. When he rode out the next day on his reshod and rested horse, he was a different man. His first act upon returning to Santa Fe was not to file a new survey, but to walk into the territorial land office and formally withdraw the eviction notice for the occupants of the Nuestra Señora del Rosario mission grant. He cited an obscure clause about the rights of historical inhabitants, an argument he would have laughed at a week earlier. But he didn't stop there. He was a man of words and records, and he now used those tools for advocacy. He wrote a long, detailed letter to the editor of La Voz del Pueblo, a prominent Spanish-language newspaper published in Las Vegas, New Mexico. He described what he had witnessed in the Chama Valley, not as a curiosity, but as a replicable miracle of engineering. He described the low fuel consumption, the stable temperatures, and the health and well-being of the 3 families inside the ruin. The editor was intrigued. In early March of 1890, as the snows finally began to melt, the newspaper dispatched a correspondent to the Chama Valley. The reporter spent 2 days with the families in the mission, measuring temperatures, sketching the layout, and interviewing Ignacio. The resulting article was a sensation. It ran on the front page under the headline, "The Winter Fortress of Rio Arriba." The centerpiece was a detailed floor plan of the mission, showing how the 3 families had partitioned the space and, most importantly, the strategic placement of the 3 fogones that charged the great Adobe battery. The story spread like fire through the Hispano communities of northern New Mexico. For generations, they had seen the dozens of abandoned mission outposts, visitas, and ranch chapels that dotted the landscape as picturesque symbols of a lost era. Now, thanks to Ignacio Delgado and Chesterfield Whitaker, they saw them as something else entirely, a blueprint for survival. They were dormant assets waiting to be reawakened. By the autumn of 1890, inspired by the article in La Voz del Pueblo, 9 other Hispano families from Taos to Abiquiu had sought out and reclaimed similar abandoned adobe structures, patching the walls, clearing the hearths, and preparing to face the winter not with fear, but with a newfound confidence in the wisdom of their ancestors. What Ignacio Delgado accomplished in the winter of 1889 was more than just a clever survival trick. Without knowing the terms, the Genízaro adobero, was practicing the most advanced principles of building science, a full century before they would be given names by modern engineers. The mission was a perfect example of a passive solar structure, absorbing energy from any winter sun that struck its southern face. The 30-inch adobe walls were a masterclass in thermal mass energy storage, a concept now used in high-end, energy-efficient homes. The slow 48-hour release of heat anticipated the design of modern masonry heaters and trombe walls, which use a dark, massive wall behind a pane of glass to collect solar energy and radiate it into the house long after sunset. Ignacio's intuitive understanding of how to create an airtight envelope by plastering the walls inside and out is the very first principle of modern building performance. He had no complex formulas or computer models. He had only the accumulated knowledge of his people and a profound, intimate understanding of his materials. He knew what the earth could do. In the end, Ignacio Delgado's genius was not that of an inventor who creates something new. It was the deeper, quieter genius of a restorer, one who sees the inherent potential in what has been forgotten. He did not look at the landscape and ask, "What can I build here?" He looked at what was already there and asked, "How can this serve life again?" He didn't build a house for each family. He didn't impose a new structure on the land, felling trees to create a shelter that would be at war with the climate. He simply looked at the forgotten mission of Nuestra Señora del Rosario, a place built to gather a community and hold them in faith, and he asked it to remember its work. He asked it to hold 3 fires instead of 1 faith, to shelter 3 families instead of 1 flock. The thick adobe walls, which had for centuries absorbed the quiet prayers of a congregation, proved just as capable of absorbing the heat of a piñon fire. The building gave that warmth back to the people, not as divine salvation, but as simple, steady, life-giving warmth. The greatest wisdom is often not in creating from scratch, but in recognizing the enduring strength and purpose in what has already been built. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If you found this story of ingenuity and resilience valuable, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more tales of forgotten wisdom. We have one last question for you. Have you ever experienced the unique feeling of being inside a thick-walled adobe or stone building during extreme weather? That sense of quiet and stability? Share your story in the comments below. The video you have just watched presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices and building science. Should you consider applying any of these historical techniques in a modern context, it is imperative to consult with qualified professionals and adhere to all current building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice